And we are recording.
Great, thank you. So Kawennenhá, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm excited to dive into this topic, but first I wanted to start by acknowledging the land that I'm situated on. Right now I'm presenting to you from Can Nonindigenous territory, which is my home community. It's about 45 minutes west of Kingston. Today I've been reflecting on my relationship to land and what that means to me, and thinking about my connection to all of creation. So I wanted to start today by just expressing my gratitude for creation and all the aspects of it that sustain us in our lives here on Earth. And today I'm particularly grateful for the sun that's shining and bringing warmth and light to us again. So I wanted to start off in that way, and so that we can all come together with good minds and focus on the task at hand, which is to talk about decolonizing and indigenizing STEM. So I'll get started with a bit of background to why this topic is important. And I think for me, the most important aspect of thinking about decolonizing and indigenizing STEM is to actually talk about those words, decolonizing and indigenizing, and what they mean, or what they can mean in the context of STEM, but also just in general and what that can mean for us as educators. So I want to talk a little bit about what is decolonization. So defining decolonization can sometimes be a difficult task because there's so many contexts and understandings and viewpoints about what it can or should mean, and also what it doesn't mean, or different ways of viewing it. So it's challenging to come up with a definition, but I think the most important thing is to think about understanding decolonization really means understanding how we understand colonization itself and our place within that process. So if we can have a sense of what colonization is, we can then begin to view decolonization as the undoing or unlearning of the colonial mindset. And that allows us to create space for Indigenous ways of knowing, including social, political, spiritual, cultural contexts and worldviews and allowing those to emerge. So I think decolonization requires us to ask ourselves these essential questions. So who am I? Where do I come from? And how and why am I connected to this place? And I think those are definitely questions I ask myself as an Indigenous person too, to maintain my connection to place and think about what that means for me. And I think throughout this presentation, a real theme is relationship and connection and what that means for us. So for more in-depth analysis of decolonization, I've listed a couple of links here to visit for more information and more kind of discussion-based topics around what it means and exploration of that. So you're welcome to check those out later on. I'll provide this presentation as well to those that are here today. So moving on from decolonization, I think it's also important to talk about indigenization and what that is. So as I mentioned, if we think about decolonization as unsettling or undoing of colonial powers and structures and ways of learning and teaching, then indigenization can be understood as redoing or reaffirming of education to include Indigenous ways of knowing, thinking, feeling, believing, and being. So this work really involves elevating the voices of Indigenous peoples, the meaningful inclusion of traditional and cultural knowledge, and intentional inclusion of Indigenous ways of teaching, and creating new pedagogical approaches, or just changing up the way that we teach and learn together. So this work can be done by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, but for non-Indigenous people to take on this work, it does require an ongoing and respectful relationship building, that ongoing consultation and partnership with Indigenous peoples. And it requires a willingness to continually engage in unlearning and unpacking of our biases, examining our power and privilege, and also constantly learning with and from Indigenous peoples about their ways of knowing and their lived experiences. So that's to me the important element of it, is that relationship and that connection. And that's, as I mentioned, a theme that we'll keep revisiting and talking about throughout this time. So the way that I hope to structure today is that I'll go through and present about the topic, and then we'll have time at the end to engage in dialogue, because I think that's the most important part, is us coming together and being able to share ideas and ask questions and explore the topic together, because really decolonization and indigenization is a lifelong initiative. It takes so much effort and work to begin to walk the path of what it means to decolonize and indigenize. And I think today is all of us kind of gathering together and saying, yes, we want to walk this path. How do we go about it, and how do we do that together? So there's different types of indigenization too, and I thought it was important to highlight the different types that there are, because the way that you look at indigenization, or the way we think about it, can influence the ways in which we engage in decolonial work and what that can mean for our specific disciplines. So there's different terms that kind of represent what various levels of indigenization are, and I recognize that it's very hierarchical the way that I've numbered it out here, and that's a very colonial way of looking at it. But it's not to say that one's greater than the other, but that there's different ways to kind of lead into this discussion. So Indigenous inclusion is the first one that I've listed here, and it's about a policy that aims to increase the number of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff in the Canadian Academy. So this is more about bringing Indigenous peoples into the Academy, bringing them into our disciplines, or having them as our instructors, having them represented across campus more broadly. And then the second one that I have listed here is reconciliation, indigenization. So this is a vision that locates indigenization on common ground between Indigenous and Canadian ideals. It's part of creating a new and broader consensus on debates around what counts as knowledge. How should Indigenous knowledge and European derived knowledge be reconciled? What can that look like? And what types of relationships academic institutions should have with Indigenous communities? And I think definitely at Queen's, we are doing Indigenous inclusion well. We're starting to see increased numbers of Indigenous faculty positions being filled. More work around decolonization is being accomplished. And we're also venturing into the reconciliation piece too, where we've been focused on broadening our understanding of perspectives, bringing in more Indigenous ways of knowing, and contributing to that work, that ongoing work, in a meaningful way. The last one that I've listed here is decolonial indigenization, and I think this is the ultimate goal of what we all hope to get to. And I think it's a long journey to fully get there, and as I said, it's ongoing, so it'll never really end. But this is where we envision the wholesale overhaul of the Academy to be fundamentally reoriented to include knowledge production based on balancing those power relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. So transforming the Academy into something dynamic and new. So these are ideas that are central, I think, in our consideration of what that kind of means to begin the process of indigenization. And Gaudry and Lawrence outlined those in such a great way of creating these different phases or ways of looking at indigenization. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the differences between Indigenous and Western knowledge. This is a great chart provided by Alaska Native Science Commission. It talks about the differences between the two knowledges. So with Indigenous knowledge, it's assumed to be the truth. Sacred and secular work together. Teaching is done a lot, often through storytelling, learning by doing and experiencing. So a lot of on the land learning, or experiential, or almost like an apprenticeship type model, where youth are learning from elders, and other community members are participating in that learning process as well. It's very oral or visual based. It's integrated, so it's based on a whole system of thinking about things, and interrelatedness and interconnection. It's very intuitive, it's holistic, subjective, and experiential. And then we have scientific knowledge, which is assumed to be at best an approximation, secular only. It's very didactic, learning by formal education, focused on written ways of communicating, analytical, based on subsets of the whole. So you can often see in science, you can look at pieces of the whole and certain strands of things can be examined without not always considering the whole as well. So there's a model or hypothesis-based inquiry as well, and then reductionist in nature sometimes, objective and positivist. So there's quite a contrast in these views, but there's also a lot of common goals, I think, with Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. And I think one of the main things that brings them together is the desire to learn more about the world around us, and the desire to just create knowledge that can foster growth and change the way that we look at our world. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about Indigenous worldviews, because I think that's so important to begin to understand what Indigenous worldviews represent or can mean. So one universal Indigenous worldview doesn't exist. There's different cultural worldviews, and there's a lot of diversity amongst different communities, nations, and groups. So, but the core is deeply connected to land and water, and our connection to those. Indigenous cultures are connected to place as well, and so that's really important for us to think about our being, our identities are very rooted in place, and our cultures and languages are very rooted in place as well. So Indigenous cultures are not static, nor have they vanished through assimilation. I think there's a sense that sometimes Indigenous cultures are very stuck in the past, but that's not the case, and that our cultures are very always on the move, and always we're always reinventing and thinking about things in new ways, and kind of bringing our teachings into the modern context as well. So many Indigenous peoples have adapted to colonial realities while holding their own cultural worldviews as well. So sometimes that's referred to as walking in both worlds, and really taking an approach where there's a lot to be learned from Western ways of knowing, but also a lot of strength in our Indigenous ways of knowing too. I think the main thing that I think about when I think about my own worldview as an Indigenous person is questions that I continually ask myself. So how am I fulfilling my responsibilities in this relationship? And how am I being a good relative? So how am I looking at the way that I think of myself, like in my connection and my relationship to all of creation, not just humans, but non-humans as well. So I think when I continually ask myself those questions, I'm always ensuring that I'm engaged in my understanding of the world and my connection from that place of knowing, and that place of being grounded in my Indigenous worldview. So there are also some core Indigenous values that are important to highlight too when we think about what it means to indigenize or decolonize, because I think it's important to recognize those differences from Western worldviews as well. So there's a sense of holism, and this means that elements of the whole are interconnected such that they cannot be understood separately nor without reference to the whole. And then there's also the concept of relationality, so a deep connection and responsibility to family, community, environment, and creation, both human and non-human relations. I think that's important too when, as educators, when we're thinking about our students and what they would like to see reflected in the curriculum and how they maybe engage with the learning materials in different ways. I think it's important to understand relationality as being a key piece to that. Then there's also the aspect of balance and harmony. So within and between all dimensions of self, wellness, relationships, environment, there's a sense of needing to have a balance or constantly working toward that balance and harmony. There's also respect and gratitude for humans and non-humans. So really thinking about, as I mentioned, your place in creation, your responsibilities to other beings and other aspects of the world, and what that means, and always coming from a place of humility and grounded in respect as well. So there's many reasons why we can look at decolonizing STEM and why it's important. I've highlighted a few of them here because I think it's important to understand why this work is important, why we want to do it, and why it's a good opportunity to engage in new ways of thinking. So it's not about abolishing the canon, but it's about interrogating its assumptions and broadening our intellectual vision to include a wider range of perspectives. It's about centering and uplifting Indigenous voices and experiences. And it also allows us to challenge the oppression of Indigenous peoples. It allows us to begin to advocate for Indigenous rights, sovereignty, land, and nation building. It also allows us to recognize that knowledge is inevitably marked by power relations, and most disciplines give disproportionate prominence to the experiences, concerns, and achievements of the dominant group. We can also begin to promote and support Indigenous ways of knowing and challenge the deficit thinking of Indigenous ways of knowing as being less than. And I think particularly for students coming into STEM fields, there's that sense of that our ways are maybe not as valid or as respected in science or STEM field. And so just rebuilding that confidence for students and allowing them to see themselves reflected in the curriculum is so important. Another thing that it allows us to do is to create and center meaningful relationship building and connection between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It allows us to combat stereotypes and promote intercultural understanding through education. And then also, it's so important, as I mentioned, for students to see themselves reflected in the curriculum and see themselves as legitimate carriers or creators of knowledge. And it's so important for them to have role models in that too, to have Indigenous faculty leading their courses, or have engagement with Indigenous elders within their courses, or have experts in the field that they can relate to and see themselves in. And that's so important for Indigenous inclusion in STEM. And then there's a lot of modern day environmental problems that have social and cultural dimensions, which can benefit greatly from perspectives other than Western science. And I think there's a lot of recent research that's come about around climate change and how using Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing and thinking to look at these issues can create new ways of solving these problems and innovative approaches to creating change as well. So you're probably asking yourselves, what can I do? Where do I begin? The task, I know, of decolonizing and indigenizing is very daunting. It can seem overwhelming, and there's a lot to it. So it's difficult to decide where you can start and when that process can begin. So I think some tips that I have are just to ask yourself why you want to decolonize, who are you doing it for, and why are you doing it? Be prepared for a long journey of self-education. So being prepared to learn and unlearn. Critically reflect on your knowledge production. So really think about your research, your teaching, and communities of practice, and what that can mean, and developing new connections, and really engaging in an ongoing way in the learning. Uplift and amplify theory, scholarship, activism of decolonizing and anti-racist Black, Indigenous, and people of color, including students. So really bringing students into the conversation as well, and considering them as partners in this journey of learning and unlearning too. Discuss and learn from others, form a community of practice. Those are the important tips, is to really find people that are also doing this work and regularly connect with them and engage in conversation. Be specific about your aims for change and their limitations. So looking at your discipline and thinking about what can I change and what are some limitations, and are there ways that I can challenge and stretch and grow, and maybe look at ways around those limitations, or ways that I can engage in different ways to make things more movable and engage myself in new ways within my work. Another one is to decenter yourself and be cognizant of your positionality and unpacking your privilege. I think that's so important to go back again to those questions that I outlined, in the importance of decolonization is like, who am I, where do I come from, and how am I connected to this place, and how do I relate to others in this place? Avoid performative allyship and extractive approaches to gaining knowledge. So really thinking about your reasons for doing it, making sure that you're going about building relationships that are reciprocal. And if you're engaging with Indigenous communities, not just thinking about what they can offer you, but also what you can offer them, and making sure that that relationship is sustainable and can continue on well beyond a certain research project or your initial reason for engagement with them. And I think importantly too is to be prepared to be uncomfortable and normalize feelings of feeling unsettled, because that's such an important part of looking at decolonization and looking at our place within that, is to recognize that there will be uncomfortable conversations, missteps, mistakes that will be made, but it's important to be forgiving, but also be comfortable with knowing that those are bound to happen. It's just part of the learning and growth process. So what does it look like and feel like to do this work, and how can non-Indigenous people contribute? So a few key ideas are deep listening, just deeply listen and engage with Indigenous knowledge holders, those that have done the work or continue to do the work, and learn from them, and being self-reflexive. So really thinking about your own self, your positionality, as I said, your ways of engaging, and being critical and willing to shape and shift those as needed. Creating space is important, and that can come in many forms. That can mean like actual space in terms of Indigenous inclusion, creating more opportunities for students to come into these programs, creating more space for Indigenous faculty to teach in them, or just creating more space for conversations like these to occur. Being in action, so constantly a commitment to constantly moving forward and keeping decolonization on your radar, and making sure that you're engaging with it in a meaningful and ongoing way. Building relationships with Indigenous people, so really thinking about what that means and starting to explore connections that you can make, and ways that you can begin to learn and learn from them and engage with them in conversations. Commitment to learning and unlearning, as I mentioned, is so important to realize that this is a journey. It's a process. It's not something that we can have a checklist about, or say that we've finally reached that point after X, Y, and Z. So it's really important to think about that in terms of a holistic view, and that it's ongoing process too. Advocating for change within educational spaces, structures, policies, and classrooms. I think this is important too, is that we move beyond just thinking about it as our own in a vacuum, and really exploring ideas for how we can share techniques or opportunities with others, so that we can all engage in this process of advocating for change. So what is being done? I think it's important to explore like some great things that are happening across the country and beyond around decolonizing STEM and what that's looked like. I found some really interesting examples when I was researching, and we have some great examples at Queen's as well. We have a lot of effort is being put into Aboriginal access to engineering for one, more inclusion in the health sciences around pathways for entrance into med school for Indigenous and Black students. There's a lot of engagement at different levels happening at Queen's, which is exciting to see. But I also looked a bit further afield and found some interesting examples around. The first one here is Decolonizing Light. It's a project around investigating the reproduction of colonialism in and through physics and higher physics education, and it explores ways to decolonize the discipline or the teaching and learning around that. And it's a very interdisciplinary team of scholars working together on that. I noticed there's a good mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but also across many disciplines. Like it's pretty impressive, the team that they've assembled to do this project. Another interesting resource that I found is Indigenous Initiatives in Engineering Education. This is an article that highlights some of the collective contributions to this work that's being done across Canada. So it was really interesting to look at that and see different institutions and their work. Another one is a narrative inquiry into experiences co-teaching alongside Cree educators. I thought this was an interesting article because it talks about indigenization and school mathematics and what that means. and what that has meant for these educators that develop partnerships with Cree educators and looked at how they could decolonize their math courses and their teaching and learning practices. And then another one that I found that's really interesting as well is decolonizing computing. And it talks a lot about what it means to decolonize. Can we decolonize computing? What does it look like? And really examining the roots of computing, like where is that grounded in? It talks about its connection to capitalism and how access to technology becomes an issue, and how we can kind of navigate those conversations as well. So then I wanted to share some of the references that I use today. These are just ones that I relied on for definitions and different things like that. And then I also provided a list of resources that I found were extremely helpful in engaging with this topic and thinking about it a bit further. And like I said, I can supply this PowerPoint so that you have these and can access them quite easily. But there's also a lot of knowledge holders and professionals and really dedicated to this work, and I thought it was worth highlighting a few that I really look to for inspiration around this topic. Dr. Leroy Littlebear is one, and he talks a lot about Blackfoot methodologies and in relation to science and how we can begin to look at decolonizing, indigenizing. Dr. Kim Tallbear also talks a lot about this topic and has some incredible webinars available online. And then most recently, I've been engaging with the work of Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, and I'm in the middle of reading her work, Braiding Sweetgrass, and I think it's just a brilliant example of what it means to explore science from both a scientific lens and an Indigenous lens. And she just does a beautiful job of writing about that and exploring that in a really meaningful way. So I'm really impressed with her work as well. And those are just some of the many experts that are available to kind of further your understanding and learning of this topic. But with that, I thought we could turn it over to kind of more of a discussion, because I find when we engage and talk about this in conversation with each other, we can share ideas, get new perspectives, and really share and exchange ideas. And I think there's a lot to learn through just discussing and asking questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen and then we can just chat a little bit. If everyone's okay with it, we can keep the recording rolling, because I think maybe some really important conversations will come out of these questions that we all have. So if that's all right, we can just continue on with recording. So there's several ways that you can engage in asking questions. You can either type them into the chat. You can use the raise hand feature to raise your hand and then grab the mic and just ask directly. So those are a couple of different ways of engaging. Cindy, go ahead.
Hi. So one of the things that I've wrestled with, especially when teaching a science course like a biochemistry course or a cell biology course, is that there is, the content that we need to cover, and there may or may not be, Indigenous stories or learning that is directly related to what we need to cover. And I think that the one thing that I'm trying to do is at least acknowledge with land acknowledgements and try to make safe spaces in the science courses so people hopefully feel more safe and comfortable. But I don't really have a good grasp of how to extend that further in the really, hard science sorts of things. So I just wanted to know if you or other people had good ideas to help promote that.
Yeah, that is the question that gets asked most often, and I came across that a lot too in researching and looking into it further myself as well. But I think the main factor that I read about was from other non-Indigenous scholars and professors doing the work is that they found ways to engage with thinking about their topic through thinking about good relations. So what does it mean to be in good relation with Indigenous peoples, and what does it mean to have their worldview reflected in content when it's not always such an easy connection to make? And they talked a lot about doing a deeper look at ways of looking at the topic. So sometimes they would talk about, for example, an example I could give is with biology. They would talk about how can I extend what I know about biology through looking at Indigenous ways of knowing, and so a lot of the efforts I think come maybe not so much with content sometimes when it's more of a very hard science, but with the way that we engage in that content. So reshaping assessments, thinking about ways that we can engage students and thinking that extends beyond maybe the traditional test or experiment, or how can they engage in that learning in a different way. And even some of the mathematical articles that I read about, the approach that they took to writing about their experience in engaging with the work in mathematics was very narrative based. So they talked about what it meant as a mathematician to then engage with Indigenous ways of knowing and then extend that to their students as well. And so I think for me, when I talk with faculty and meet with faculty around how to decolonize their course, it really comes down to, are there ways that you can engage in thinking about something differently or coming at it from a different lens? And that differs course by course, but there's often ways that you can kind of create more movement in terms of engaging with students than you can with the content when it comes to something very specific, like you said, cells or things that are very difficult to think more in terms of content, right? So that's very generic, I realize, but I think that's where conversations and engagement on a one-to-one level are helpful. Like when I meet with faculty, I can see their syllabus or I can see where they're heading with the course and really offer more concrete ideas for how to do that. And then also me not being a content expert, it's helpful to have conversations with faculty around, this is the content that I need to cover, this is what it means, and this is what I really require my students to know. And I can then help them figure out how to still achieve that, but then also include some other Indigenous ways of knowing too.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I most appreciate that I have been learning is the stories and analogies that a lot of the Indigenous ways of knowing and telling and recounting seem to have. And I feel like that, how you do your assessments, could be a great way, even if somebody is not Indigenous, but from a different culture too, could bring in their own ideas. If you have something like a presentation or, explain to somebody else sort of types of assessments or discussion boards could be an opening maybe. And hopefully, a way of being culturally appropriate as well.
Great, thank you. If anyone has any further thoughts, they can add in the chat or speak up. And I see that David, you have your hand up. You can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So following up on an earlier slide and what Cindy was talking about and what Lindsay was talking about, these are just some thoughts that I haven't perfectly organized yet, but I was reminded of when we first started trying to introduce active learning into classes. There was a lot of resistance from a lot of faculty who said, we have so much to cover, we can't add this. And I wonder if some of that's happening again, where with the answer we got back from the active learning people was students will learn better the smaller amount of stuff you cover than they would when you had a extremely packed curriculum. Now, I found that particular advice extremely difficult to get my head around because my courses have so much content. What am I going to do? But I wonder if there's a parallel here between saying, do we really need every piece of content? Can we make room for other kinds of activities or topics or approaches to learning that that are more important than some of the content. I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me there's a parallel between what we were doing 20 years ago when active learning started to become a big idea that we were supposed to adapt to. And now perhaps indigenization is a similar sort of thing. Maybe some of the things that we're being asked to incorporate are more important than some of the things we have.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting connection that you've made between that Indigenous ways of knowing or decolonizing work and active learning, and that initial pushback is that it feels like an add-on, but really to truly do the work of decolonization and indigenization, it's not an add-on. It's something that we really need to fully integrate. And I think too, students really appreciate when it is built in and it is integrated in such a way. And as an example, I just finished up teaching a course in the commerce program, and students were saying like it's so refreshing to engage with talking about commerce and capitalism from a new perspective that we never would have been introduced to before, and to think about that. And a lot of the learning around key concepts that we wanted them to learn came from their own self reflection and knowledge around the topic. So they came prepared to class with conversations around capitalism, commerce, what does that mean? And this is what I thought it meant before, but now I'm beginning to see that there's different ways of looking at it. And I think through those conversations and through that connection, we were able to cover topics that, you know, in a different approach and in a different way of looking at them, right? So it's really interesting to see that happen and to see the students recognizing that they're engaging in a different way and that learning is taking place, but it's in a very different method and approach.
Well, following up on that, both what Cindy was talking about earlier and what Lindsay just said about narrative as a tool for understanding, because just I reflected on my own experience where students will sit there bored when you're covering what we think of as content with didactic style, but they perk up when you give a story that says, for example, when I was working at this company, we did this and that, and this is what went wrong. The stories engage the students more than the didactic stuff did. And okay, and that was the 2 points I wanted to make. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I see we have some questions in the chat. We'll get to those in 1 minute, but I think I'll turn it to Jenny.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate you kind of explaining everything in your presentation in such a way. I'm a bit of a visual learner, so having the points on the slide was very helpful. I think I just want to add to what was previously said about the narrative tool and the storytelling, and using even something like current news or social issues and tying them into what might be considered hard science or hard math or physics. There's always a way to kind of tie in current events. So I think that's really an exciting way to, as was mentioned, perk up the students and get them engaged with the content. And also the self-reflection piece, I think, can be really powerful in, like, as someone coming from a science background, you're always used to memorizing things, but you're never asked to reflect on why you're learning on something. And so incorporating that even through assessments doesn't necessarily affect the content that you need to teach. So I think that's an interesting strategy to take in the context of decolonization and indigenization. And then finally, I did want to bring up one more thing, but I think I forgot, so I'll end it there.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing, and I'll kind of turn it over to the things in the chat, because I think these are really valuable as well to talk about. So one of them was recognizing the difference between decolonization and reconciliation. Want to bring in the question whether we can even start reconciling before decolonization, because we might run the risk of appropriating knowledge if we take the shortcut around decolonizing, especially in STEM, where these conversations might not be as prevalent as in other disciplines, like, for example, cultural studies or other social sciences. So I think that's really important. And I think the work of decolonization is really necessary to do first. And Robin had commented too about in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, there's a lot of talk about needing to address the truth first, the truth of our past, our histories, and how that still influences our connection and relationship with each other today. And I think it's so important to do that work first and then come back to what it means to reconcile and what that can truly mean once we have an understanding of what it means to decolonize and indigenize and bring forward Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So thank you so much for pointing that out, because I think that is an important kind of distinction to make and determining how we move forward and really thinking about what it means to decolonize before we do move towards reconciliation. And the Truth and Reconciliation report and Senator Murray Sinclair that was engaged in that work at the time and really talked about education as being a key piece to reconciliation and learning about that truth and learning about the history and the past so that we can move forward in a good way together. Okay, so any other questions? Robin, go ahead.
Oops. Thanks so much for this, Lindsay. It's been really great to hear your perspectives. I wondered if, kind of following up on the conversation we've been having about feeling like you can't change your content because there's so much that you need to cover. I know that I think for me, at least, I've heard Dylan Robinson, who's in multiple faculties or multiple disciplines here at Queen's, has talked about treating content in a syllabus or a course almost like land, and talking about the idea that particularly for settlers and for white settlers of European descent, giving back content and space in your syllabus is almost like giving back land. And I wondered if you'd encountered that idea at all within the hard sciences in particular, because I think about conversations I've had with nursing folks, for instance, who say, but I need my students to know how to insert a catheter. We can't cut that. But then I also think about, well, that's kind of equivalent, or could it be equivalent to a group of people saying, well, but my house needs to be next to that golf course and I need to have that development. So I'm sorry, Six Nations, you can't have it back. So I wonder if there's anything that you came across that talks about that conversation, or those really practical questions that I know instructors have about, I want to give back that content space, but I also have accreditation requirements or these things that are holding me.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, Dylan's idea around thinking about land or thinking about curriculum as almost like land. And I think that's so important for considering how it is an effort to kind of give back and create space and open up space where engagement with Indigenous ways of knowing is something that we can naturally do, and it comes into our courses in different ways. And I did come across that a lot in my reading and research around faculty facing that exact question of how do I do that, but there are certain things that I need to cover, and how do I make sure that I cover that? And a lot of them, it came to them thinking about their discipline and so why is it that we have to know this certain thing, and why is it that we have to know it in this way? And particularly for the mathematics ones that I looked at, they talked a lot about questioning their discipline and how it came to be, and the knowledge structure and basis for it. And even the computing article talked about that too, how computing, you don't think about ways that you can decolonize it, because sometimes you think, well, it's like numbers, there's a lot of like formulaic things that we need to know about it, and same with math. But the common theme was that there were ways to think about the implications of knowledge and kind of the power imbalances within that field. And so with computing, it became about access. It became about thinking about ways that some people are not able to access internet connection, for one, or that it becomes an idea of inclusion too, to be able to say that we can provide more access to these things, and that there aren't people aren't lacking in their ability to participate in technology, and that sometimes even technology is not as accessible as we would like it to be, and how can we look at that differently? So I think it's important that to be able to engage in conversations like that more broadly too, to think about the discipline and how could that way of thinking about what is important be shifted a little bit as well. Okay, I think there's a few more questions or comments in the chat. One thing that's been brought to mind from this presentation is that decolonization is more than just anti-racism. Yeah, it really does extend beyond that. I mean, that's a piece of it, and inclusion's a piece of it. But as I mentioned, it's important to really shift the structure or the way that we think about education as well. Yes, being explicit in stating to students why you included a discussion or reflection point that's inspired or based on Indigenous ways of knowing, learning, and being is powerful. A short way to introduce learners to new ideas or concepts and important topics, and then encourages them to do the same and maybe some more self-directed learning. I think that's important too, is to be intentional about the inclusion of these things, and also to bring those to your students' attention. I think that's great, a great way of looking at it too. Okay, and then we have another comment. I teach within Trent's Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences program. To help with the challenge of adding, decolonizing, and indigenizing content, we created a required introductory course for majors. The course focuses on worldview, Indigenous knowledge, and settler colonialism. That's great, and I think that discussion has definitely been ongoing at Queen's too, around mandatory courses. Do we need to have those implemented across campus more broadly? Would it be good to have almost like an introduction to decolonial approaches in certain disciplines? So almost like every discipline could have their own introductory course that talks about kind of unsettling the discipline or what that could mean. I'd be interested to kind of hear about how that's going. Barbara, how long have you had that that mandatory course at Trent?
We've had this course for about 4 years now, and it's now on, I don't know if you're aware that Trent has that Indigenous content requirement for all Trent students. And this has become one of the really popular Indigenous course requirement courses. And, you know, it's really been interesting. So I teach from my perspective as a Anishinaabe, and it's been really interesting to, as an instructor, reconcile the differences between students that are focused in hard science and students that are focused in social science, and really trying to get them to understand that there's other ways of knowing. And it's very unsettling for them in the first few weeks of the course, and then all of a sudden there's this aha moment, and they're able to shift their way of thinking and their acceptance of Indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, that aha moment is kind of what I live for as an educator as well. It's so amazing to see the transformation from the beginning of a course to the end of the course in these students, and to see that along the way as they're progressing, and really you can just see the light bulbs coming on, and they're engaging in different ways, and it's so exciting. And that's, I think, just shows like the impact that this work can have on students. And thanks for sharing the Trent experience. I think that's really fascinating. Trent's close to my heart. That's where I did my undergrad, so I'm glad to have some of you from Trent here today as well. Farah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate student, and I've been trying to find the words that I want to say for a while. So forgive me if I'm kind of all over the place, but I know that we've been talking about very deliberate, very conscious efforts that we put forward, or at least professors here, to put forward to teach students incorporating Indigenous ways of knowledge. but something that I've kind of been thinking about for a while being a student is maybe not the very direct ways that professors talk about Indigenous stories, ways of knowing, but kind of the very structure of teaching, I guess. What I mean is ideologies that are put forth in biology specifically, because that's what I'm majoring in. But, you know, for example, hierarchical structures in nature and how students and people in the public take that into their own experience as a human. I know, like, obviously, if you look in the past, every time something new has come around, evolution, for example, it has been appropriated into white supremacy and Western culture as a method for discrimination. And I wanted to know what kind of things can I do as a student, and what professors can do to kind of look at these kind of maybe implicit biases in the way biology and other topics are taught within universities, rather than only the very direct things that they can do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I understand where you're coming from for sure. I think what's been helpful to me is to kind of reframe what it means to decolonize and really think about how we engage with students in different ways. And actually, students have been at the forefront of leading efforts to decolonize. There was a lot of examples in the UK of students actually outright protesting their course content and the ways that the curriculum was being delivered, and saying, we demand that this be decolonized. Your approach to teaching at this university isn't meaningful for us, and we want to see changes. And I think a lot of efforts at Queen's have around EDII work and thinking about this have also been student driven, saying, look, we expect more, we want this engagement at a different level, and we want to bring these issues to your attention. And so that's been great that students have really been vocal about that and have been leading these initiatives in many ways. I think too, it's important to think about not just content, but also approaches. So what are some new ways that I can engage students in learning this? A lot of recognition of students as being contributors to the learning environment too. A lot of Indigenous ways of looking at teaching and learning are recognizing that there's an equality in the learning space, and that students can teach just as much as they can learn. And that as an instructor, I try to decentralize my role, and I see my role, rather than a teacher or an instructor, to be more of a facilitator and someone who guides my students towards the learning and helps them to engage in that thought process and that way of learning, but not that I'm the expert or the only one that knows the content. And so I think that's really important when it comes to decolonizing work, is to think about our role too in that, and how we can kind of shift and use our students or leverage their power that they have as powerful teachers to create a classroom where there's that equality and that balance as well. So I hope that answers the question and in some way. I think there's so many ways to look at it, and like I said, students are really good teachers in the sense that they'll help contribute ideas to the course. Many of my students have taught me so much along the way as well, and I think David has left now, but he had brought an important point about there's always that resistance at first, but then once you get past that, it can be such a powerful way of learning, and students are much more flexible and capable than we sometimes give them credit for, I think, in shifting gears and trying out new ways of knowing and being and experiencing that for the first time. And really, they're good at reflecting on it too, if you give them the opportunity to reflect and share on what that's meant for them in their learning experience too. Okay, so I think we're coming up on the end of time, but I just wanted to thank you all again so much for coming today, and and sharing with all of us in this discussion in this space. And as I mentioned, I will send out the PowerPoint presentation so that you have access to those links. And I think what I would like to do too is to continue to build kind of a base of articles and really great webinars and things around this topic that I've collected along the way. And I can maybe create a resource on our Center for Teaching and Learning website where some of those are highlighted, because I think it's so important and to share those resources when we have them with each other. You'll also notice in the chat that there's a short evaluation form that you can fill out around today's session. So we would appreciate if you could do that. But other than that, thank you very much, and I'll let you all go.